Since early March, COVID-19 has dominated the news, and this will likely continue to be the case in the coming months. While it may be tempting to watch the news for the latest updates, what you focus on influences how you feel. And the more you focus on news that is stressful or anxiety-provoking, the more contagious these emotions can become. Hi everyone, I'm Trevor Sullivan from Sullivan Associates Clinical Psychology. And today I'm going to talk about how to deal with stressful news during the COVID-19 pandemic. Before we get started, I invite you to subscribe to this channel. And if you're on YouTube, click the alert notification. That way, when we release more videos like this, you'll get notified. With the COVID-19 pandemic, things are changing by the minute, and it can be tempting to follow along to keep up with all the latest developments. Not to mention, the coronavirus is being mentioned literally everywhere you turn. So you might be wondering, can it really be that stressful to stay tuned into the news for long periods of time? In a 2014 study by Dr. Veronica Engert and colleagues, they found that simply seeing people under stress, even when you're not involved with a stressful event, is enough to raise cortisol levels, which is the main stress hormone in the body. And if we happen to see someone we know under stress, our stress response, it's even greater. So while it's important to stay informed, I have a few suggestions for handling the news during the current pandemic. First, set aside no more than 2 times a day to watch the news, and limit it to a maximum of 15 to 20 minutes each time. I'd suggest tuning to the news once in the morning and once in the evening, so it allows you the opportunity to keep up with the latest information. So you're probably wondering, why only 15 to 20 minutes of news at a time? The reason is, the longer we focus on things that are stressful, the more likely we are to catastrophize, which means we start to imagine things turning out far worse than they likely will. And needless to say, getting stuck in this pattern will significantly increase feelings of anxiety. For my second tip, I'd suggest focusing on local news. Our experience with COVID-19 in Thunder Bay in Northern Ontario has been far different than what's occurring in many areas of the United States, or even Southern Ontario or Quebec. At the time of this recording, there's been 78 reported cases in the Thunder Bay district, of which 68 have resolved. So we've handled the pandemic quite well so far. But for the areas where it's been a bigger challenge, the focus of news stories is going to be on struggle and hardship, as these stories are always the ones that are most compelling. And unfortunately, the most compelling stories involve the spread of the virus, a lack of resources, lack of treatment, and unfortunately casualties. So taking the time to watch the news that's focused on areas that are being hit harder by the virus is at the very least exposing yourself to a lot of unnecessary stress. But you may be wondering, is it really that bad to see unpleasant images on the news? Such as watching a story in New York about the number of casualties from the virus has led to the deceased being stored in refrigeration trucks? The short answer is, it can be quite damaging. A 2015 study by Dr. Pam Ramsden looked at the impact of viewing violent news events in the media. In her study, she found that 25% of the people had PTSD symptoms after viewing unpleasant events. This effect is known as vicarious traumatization, which means that simply watching these events and feeling the suffering of other people can negatively impact you and become traumatizing. In this study, it was also found that the more people viewed these events, the more traumatized they became. So simply put, do your best to avoid watching these types of news stories. If you have a family member who lives in one of the areas that's struggling with the virus, I encourage you to reach out to them and show that you care. They'll keep you informed of what's going on in their area, which can help you to avoid watching the news in their region and potentially being exposed to seeing unpleasant images of other people suffering. For my third tip, I'd highly encourage you to avoid, or at the very least minimize, the amount of news you're watching when children and teens are around. For those of you who have children who struggle with stress and anxiety, there's a strong genetic component, so they come by it honestly. What about children and teens who aren't particularly anxious? A 2015 study by Dr. Thalia Ely and colleagues found that anxiety is contagious, and it can be easily passed from adults to children and vice versa. And given the current state of the news, most adults would be pretty hard pressed to watch the news and not exude a bit of stress and anxiety about what they're seeing on the screen. Next, I encourage you to minimize talking about the news. So while it's beneficial to cut down on watching the news to 2 15 to 20 minute time periods a day, you aren't much further ahead if the rest of the day is spent focusing on and talking about the news with others. Actually, spending time talking about the news can be causing you to feel even more stressed. In a 2018 study, Dr. Robert Jagello and Dr. Thomas Hills, They found that when people talk about the news with someone else, they tend to make the story more negative than it actually is. And when that person tells a news story, they make it more negative, and so on. In this study, the researchers found this effect to be particularly strong with sensitive news topics, such as the current pandemic we're experiencing. But if that isn't enough to convince you to minimize talking about the news, I've got one more important tidbit from this study. Dr. Jagello and Dr. Hills found that once people were told they were making the news story more negative than it actually was, and then provided the facts once again, they still continued to tell the story in a way that made it more negative than it actually was. So needless to say, if you want to discuss the news with someone, be careful who you choose to speak to. It's easy to make the story more negative than it actually is, which then becomes a difficult pattern to break. An ideal person to talk to about the news is someone who's understanding, can acknowledge your feelings, but also does well at remaining calm and focusing on facts. And for my final tip, I'd suggest seeking out at least one positive news story every day. During stressful and uncertain times, it's helpful to be reminded that there's still good things going on in the world. And not only can this help you to feel more positive, it can have a significant effect on how others feel. Let me explain. And to do so, I'm going to go all the way back to 2012. Back then, Facebook agreed to participate in a study with researchers at Cornell University. And Facebook's role in the study was to manipulate the news feeds of its users. Once the study results were released, Facebook took quite a bit of heat for manipulating people's news feeds, but it produced some pretty interesting results that can help us here. So for the study, they had a group of people who saw content in their news feeds that was more emotionally negative, while other people saw content that was more emotionally positive. And what the researchers found is that when people were exposed to emotionally negative content, the status updates they made afterwards were emotionally negative. And as you might guess, for people who saw more positive content in their news feeds, the status updates they made afterwards were emotionally positive. So the take-home message here is that both positive and negative emotions are contagious online. So if you make an effort to seek out positive news stories, this can not only help you to feel better, it can help others to feel more positive. So what you post on social media after viewing something positive tends to be more positive as well. And for anyone who spends little time online or finds it difficult to track down a positive news story, I encourage you to read an inspiring book about someone who's persisted through hard times, such as Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning. One of the greatest gifts we have is the persistence of the human spirit. So to provide a quick recap, first, you want to limit time watching the news to no more than 2 times a day, 15 to 20 minutes maximum each time. Second, focus on watching local news, since it'll give you a more accurate view about events that are impacting your daily life. Third, avoid watching news around children and teens. Emotions are contagious, and stressful, anxiety-provoking news is especially contagious. Number 4, minimize talking about the news. The more you talk about the news, the greater likelihood it'll increase feelings of stress, and there's a chance that you or someone else will talk about the news in a way that makes it seem more negative than it actually is, even if you don't mean to do so. And my final tip, seek out a positive news story, or make a point of reading something positive or uplifting each day. So I hope you found these tips to be helpful. If you did, I encourage you to subscribe to this channel by clicking the subscribe button below. If you're already a subscriber, please feel free to like and share this video. If you're experiencing challenges with managing stress or anxiety during the current pandemic, please contact us at Sullivan Associates Clinical Psychology. So now it's your turn. What tips are you going to try? Are you ready to limit the amount of news you watch, or make a point of seeking out a positive news story every day? Or do you have a different strategy you'd like to use to help deal with stressful news? Please let me know in the comment section below.